3. Most unsettling. Mysterious snake horror stories. The town of Windfall had always been quiet, a place where the only sound you could hear at night was the wind rustling through the trees. It was the kind of place that drew Liddell in, with its peaceful solitude. She had moved there months ago, tired of the endless noise of city life, hoping the quiet would give her the peace she needed. Her little cottage sat at the edge of the woods, isolated, yet somehow comforting. For the most part, she had felt safe in her little sanctuary. That is, until one night when everything changed. It started subtly, like a whisper at the back of her mind that she could not quite place. A nagging feeling, not strong enough to alarm her, but persistent. Something is wrong. Liddell brushed it off at first. She was just tired, that's all. She had been working long hours, and her mind was probably playing tricks on her. But as the evening wore on, that uneasy feeling lingered. It clung to her like a heavy fog, and no matter what she did, she could not shake it. As she prepared dinner in the kitchen, a faint scraping sound interrupted her thoughts. At first, she thought it was the wind. An old house creaks sometimes, after all. But this was different. The sound did not stop. It scraped again, and then again. Her heart skipped a beat. Liddell stood still, the knife in her hand trembling slightly. The sound, it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within her home. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She looked toward the floor, her mind racing. It seemed to be coming from beneath the floorboards. No, it can't be. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination. Maybe it was a rat, or a mouse, a squirrel even. But no, the scraping was too deliberate, too purposeful. It was almost as if something, or someone, was trying to get through. Liddell took a hesitant step backward, her pulse quickening. Her breath was shallow, and her fingers tightened around the knife. She stood there, motionless, straining to hear the sound, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The scraping stopped. A long, eerie silence followed. Her heart was hammering in her chest now, each beat reverberating in her ears. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. And then it happened. The scraping resumed, louder this time, sharper. And then a soft slither. Liddell froze, her blood running cold. That was not a mouse. It was too smooth, too sinister. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. Her eyes darted around the kitchen, desperately searching for something to protect herself with, anything. And that's when she saw it. A shape, a movement in the corner of her vision. A long, dark form. Too long, too fluid. The snake. Liddell's breath caught in her throat, and her stomach dropped. She had heard stories, of course, about snakes that could get into houses, but she never thought she would encounter one, especially not like this. It slithered across the floor, slow but deliberate, gliding toward her with an unnerving grace. Its cold, unblinking eyes locked onto hers, and her breath hitched. She stood frozen, trapped in place by its gaze. Oh God, no, please, no! The fear coursed through her like ice in her veins. She had heard that snakes could sense fear, but in this moment, she did not care. Her heart pounded in her chest, her body shaking. It was like the world around her had ceased to exist, leaving only her and the snake. The snake, it was huge, bigger than anything she had imagined. It was so still, yet so dangerous. She could hear her own pulse now, deafening in her ears. She needed to move. She needed to run. Without thinking, Liddell turned and bolted toward the door, her heart racing, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The door was only a few feet away, just a few more steps, and she would be outside, away from the horror that lurked inside her home. But just as she reached for the doorknob, she heard it. The unmistakable sound of the snake's body shifting, sliding closer. It was moving, right behind her. She gasped, yanking open the door and stumbling into the night air. Her feet flew across the porch and she didn't look back. Not even once. Lydell stood there, trembling in the cool night air. She pressed her back against the railing, trying to steady her breathing, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. It was gone now. It had to be. But then, a rustle. It came from inside the house. The door she had left wide open. Lydell spun around, her heart stopping. It had followed her. Her mind raced. The door was wide open. Could it have slithered outside? Could it be out there, somewhere in the dark? The fear was suffocating. It made it hard to think. It could still be in there. With shaking hands, Lydell took a few steps forward, her mind a blur. She couldn't just leave. She had to go back inside. She had to know. So forcing herself to turn around, she took a few deep breaths and walked back into the house. The kitchen was still, eerily quiet. But the floor, something was wrong. The dust, the little bits of debris on the floor, were disturbed. There was a trail, a disturbance, something that should not have been there. Lydell's eyes followed the trail, her breath catching again. It was unmistakable. It was from the snake. It had been here. It had moved across the floor. The evidence was there, right in front of her. And now, it was just as if the house was waiting for her to find it. She stepped forward, her pulse racing, and then she froze. Something glinted in the dim light. A small vent. It had always been there. But tonight it was different. The metal was bent, twisted, as though something had forced its way through. Her blood ran cold. The snake. It had come through there. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of panic. How could this happen? How had it gotten in? And then, the rustling. Behind her. Closer now. Lydell turned in slow motion, her eyes widening. The snake. It was there, just feet away from her. Moving out of the shadows, its long body gliding across the floor with ease. Its cold eyes gleamed, locking onto hers. And for the first time, Lydell understood. She was not safe. Not anymore. This is very disturbing. Mysterious Snake Horror Story number 2. Lyric had been looking forward to this weekend for months. A retreat into the wilderness, far away from the noise and stress of the city. Just a simple cabin in the woods, far from anyone. Peace and quiet. That's what she needed. She arrived just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the narrow road that twisted through the forest. The trees felt different here, taller, darker, like they were closing in. She shook off the sensation, telling herself it was just the isolation playing tricks on her mind. When she finally reached the cabin, nestled in the heart of the woods, she felt a brief moment of relief. The cabin was quaint, old-fashioned, with a little stone chimney puffing out smoke. Perfect. She was ready to relax. But as she unpacked, she could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier. The silence was too thick. That night, as Lyric sat in front of the crackling fire, reading a book, the quiet outside was unsettling. She tried to focus on the words, but something kept tugging at her attention. A soft, rhythmic hissing. Faint at first, barely noticeable. At first, she thought it was the wind, the trees shifting in the breeze. But then, no, this was different. Her heart began to pound, a little faster than usual. She stood up slowly, her feet moving almost instinctively toward the window. She peered out into the darkness, scanning the tree line. The wind was howling, the trees creaking, but nothing. No sign of movement. But then she heard it again, the hissing. It was closer now, louder. Lyric's breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening. There was no mistaking it. The sound was coming from outside. Was it an animal? She told herself it must be. Maybe a snake, or a creature she had not encountered before. But why did it feel deliberate, like it was waiting for something? Her instincts told her to stay inside, but the curiosity gnawed at her. Maybe it was just a small animal, harmless. After all, it was just a sound. That's all it was. But deep down, she knew. This was not normal. She stood frozen for a moment, staring into the black void outside the window. And then, as if in response to her thoughts, the hissing sound grew louder still, closer, almost right outside her door. Lyric could not breathe. Her heart was racing in her chest, thundering in her ears. She had to look. She flung the door open, stepping outside into the cold, damp night. The air felt sharper now, like the forest itself was watching her, listening. The wind cut through her jacket, but she barely felt it. All her senses were focused on the sound, the hissing. It was unmistakable now. There, just ahead, something moved, a long, slithering shape, barely visible in the dim light. Lyric's blood ran cold. The snake. It was right there in front of her, its body stretched out along the ground, coiling around a tree. Its eyes, dark, gleaming, fixed on her, watching her. Fear rushed through her like a tidal wave. Her body was frozen in place. The snake did not move. It just watched. Her breath quickened. The sound of the wind no longer seemed to matter. The only thing that mattered now was the feeling of those eyes on her. She backed away slowly, her feet barely touching the ground, her mind screaming for her to run, but her legs, stiff, rooted to the spot, refused to move. The snake did not move either. It simply remained there, locked in place, waiting. Her mind screamed at her to get back to the cabin, but before she could take another step, the snake made a small movement. Its head darted forward. Just a little. A warning? It felt like hours passed in those few moments. Lyric's mind raced, her thoughts spinning wildly. She needed to get inside, now. But she could not take her eyes off the snake. Slowly her legs began to move. One step, two. She was nearly there, her hand gripping the doorknob when she heard it again. The hiss. Closer. She slammed the door shut, her heart in her throat. She pressed her back against it, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the lock, her eyes never leaving the window, watching for any sign of movement. The snake had to be gone, right? But no. It had not moved. It was still there, watching. The hours crawled by. Every sound, the wind, the snap of twigs, the rustling of the trees, seemed like a threat. The hissing came again, but this time it was different. It was louder, sharper. It was closer. Lyric could not sleep. Her eyes darted back and forth in the darkness, scanning the room. She could hear her pulse in her ears, the steady thrum of fear. Was the snake still out there? Was it waiting? Her mind wandered. What did it want? What was it doing here? She had read stories about snakes stalking their prey, waiting for the right moment to strike, but this felt different. It felt like the snake was trying to make a point, trying to say something. As the night wore on, Lyric finally made a decision. She could not stay. Something was wrong. It was not just the snake. It was the feeling in the air, the oppressive weight of the forest. She had to leave. Now she packed her things quickly, her hands shaking as she stuffed her clothes into the bag. The hissing had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the first move. She rushed to the door, throwing it open. The wind hit her face like a slap, cold and biting. But she did not care. She had to leave. Now. But just as she stepped outside, the hissing returned. It was behind her. It was inside. The snake was no longer just a creature from the woods. It was something else, something dark, something that had been waiting for her, following her every move. Lyric could not run anymore. She had nowhere to go. The snake was everywhere. It had been watching her, all along. It was the end of summer when Saffron first noticed it. The unsettling silence. The forest had always been alive with the sounds of nature. Birds calling, the wind rustling through the leaves, the hum of distant insects. But now there was nothing. The usual chorus of the woods had gone silent. And it was not just quiet. It was unnervingly still. Every time Saffron tried to shake the feeling, it came back stronger. At first, she told herself it was her imagination. After all, she was alone in a secluded cabin deep in the woods. But then, there were those moments, those fleeting moments, when she could feel it. Someone, or something, was watching her. She had rented this cabin to escape, to get away from the noise, from the chaos. She had wanted peace, and at first the silence had felt peaceful. But now, it felt oppressive, as if the air around her was growing heavier with each passing day. The first few days were nice. Mornings were spent on the porch, sipping her tea and watching the sunrise. Afternoons, she hiked the trails, soaking in the isolation, the feeling of being utterly alone. But that feeling, being watched, did not fade. It only grew stronger. Every time she turned a corner, every time she stepped deeper into the woods, she felt eyes on her. The first night it happened, she dismissed it. She had been drifting off to sleep when, in the silence, she swore she heard something. Just a faint movement, like something slithering across the ground. But she convinced herself it was the wind, or perhaps an animal outside. The second night it was louder, scratching. She lay in bed listening, her heart racing. The sound was unmistakable. Something was out there. Slowly, carefully, she got out of bed and crept to the window. Her eyes scanned the dark yard below, the trees shifting gently in the breeze. But there was nothing. No sign of movement. The woods were as still as ever. Her breath was shallow. She pulled the blinds shut and tried to calm herself, but the dread remained. What if it was not just an animal? What if something was watching her, waiting for her to let her guard down? But it wasn't until the third night that everything changed. Saffron had decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would calm her racing mind. The fog had started to roll in, the trees becoming little more than shadowy figures through the mist. It felt wrong. The woods were too quiet. The fog felt too thick, too close. But she kept walking. Step, step, step. Her boots pressed into the wet earth, the only sound in the suffocating silence. But then, movement. Just a flicker at the edge of her vision. Something fast, something big. A shadow darting between the trees. She froze, her heart stopping in her chest. Her breath hitched. She turned slowly, trying to locate the movement, but all she saw were the trees, silent and unmoving. Was it her imagination? Was she just jumpy from too much time alone? But then, there it was again. A flash, long, slithering, and impossibly quick. Something was moving through the trees, something large, and it was moving closer. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she was frozen. And then she saw it. A snake. It was long, at least 6 feet, and coiled around the base of an oak tree, its dark, glistening scales blending into the shadows of the night. At first, she thought it was a branch, but no. There was no mistaking those eyes. Those bright yellow eyes gleaming in the dark. Her breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to freeze. She could not move. She could not look away. It was as if the snake was looking right into her soul. Its gaze was unblinking, unmoving. For a long moment, neither of them did anything. Neither of them made a sound. Saffron could feel her heart beating wildly in her chest, each thump so loud she thought the snake might hear it. She took a slow step back, but her legs were shaky. What was it doing? Why wasn't it moving? The snake's eyes remained locked on hers. It did not move a muscle, not a single flicker of its tongue. It just watched. She took another step back, but this time, the snake uncoiled. Slowly, almost deliberately, its body stretched out along the ground like a sinuous shadow. Her pulse quickened. She took another step, her feet unsteady. And then, the snake hissed. The sound was deafening. The air around her seemed to pulse with tension. Her body went rigid, and before she could think, before she could react, she turned and ran faster than she ever thought possible. Her heart pounded in her ears, the sound of her breath ragged and frantic. The snake's hiss seemed to echo in her mind, but there was no time to look back. She ran until she reached the cabin, slamming the door behind her. She leaned against it, gasping for air. Her hands trembled. It took a while for her to calm down, but when she did, she told herself it was over. The snake was gone. She was safe. But that night, as she sat on the porch, watching the fog roll through the trees, she noticed something. The air had gone still, too still. And then she saw it. The snake. It was coiled beneath the porch steps. Those same yellow eyes stared up at her, watching. She felt a shiver race down her spine. She backed away slowly, her chest tight with fear. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her things, heading for the car. She started the engine, trying to steady her breath. But as she drove away, she could still feel its eyes. She could feel them burning into her back, watching, waiting. And deep down, she knew. She was not safe. It was still out there, still waiting.